Hi everyone, I'm Anya Parampil and you're watching Red Lines. The US government recently escalated its war against Wikileaks founder Julian Assange when it handed down a superseding indictment, which the Justice Department says broadens, quote, the scope of the conspiracy surrounding alleged computer intrusion with which Assange was previously charged. The indictment does not, however, levy any new charges against the Wikileaks founder. So what purpose does it serve? To find out, I spoke with Kevin Gosztola, an editor with Shadowproof Media and co-host of the Unauthorized Disclosure Podcast. He recently published a piece titled U.S. Government Expands Assange Indictment to Criminalize Assistance Provided to Edward Snowden. Kevin, thanks so much for your time this afternoon. You say in your recent article that this superseding indictment is designed to criminalize assistance WikiLeaks provided to NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. Why?
Yeah, so this expanded indictment was issued by the Justice Department past week, and it was remarkable to me because they added a section to it. They didn't add additional charges, but they added a section to it that specifically focused upon what they allege is as Assange's and WikiLeaks recruitment of system administrators. And they specifically go after Sarah Harrison, who is WLA4 in the indictment, and they target her for assisting Snowden in leaving Hong Kong safely after he worked on the NSA documents with Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras and Ewan McCaskill. And of course, just to make sure people are aware of the event, Sarah was helping to broker asylum agreements, trying to find some place that Edward Snowden could go. She accompanied him. And when they were in the Moscow airport, in the Sheremetyevo airport in Moscow, they were stranded because the State Department had his passport revoked. And so he no longer could leave the country. And that's where they then worked on getting asylum. They went to 21 or so different countries, including Germany. And eventually the Russian government agreed to provide asylum to Edward Snowden despite pressure from the United States. And so in this indictment that was expanded, they add extra evidence to punch up this manner in which they're trying to make Julian Assange seem like more of a hacker than a journalist, somebody who is working to purloin documents from the United States government. And they go after Sarah and say that the reason why she accompanied Snowden was mostly kind of a ploy to get WikiLeaks' name out there and convince more system administrators to give documents, to steal documents for WikiLeaks. And so I found that to be really alarming, because why she says she went with Snowden to travel from Hong Kong and find him a place of safety is because she knew very well the record of President Barack Obama's administration and how it had prosecuted more whistleblowers under the Espionage Act than all previous presidential administrations combined. And so she thought, rather than leave him out in the cold in the way that The Guardian was doing by not offering any sort of source protection, even though they had benefited greatly from publishing his documents, why not have someone go and make sure that he can get to safety, because she knew that the United States government was going to do everything in their power to try and capture and bring Snowden back to the United States and put him on trial for revealing information about a massive global surveillance operation that he had exposed. And so, to see this, I think it's kind of a dramatic escalation in the sense that we're going from looking at a specific leak, looking at a specific source to journalist relationship that happened. We're going beyond criminalizing that relationship that existed between Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and then Chelsea Manning. And we're now going to look at what WikiLeaks was doing between this time frame of 2009 and 2015. And we're going to bring in the Edward Snowden disclosures in the way that WikiLeaks was supportive of Edward Snowden in order to make it seem like what Assange and WikiLeaks does is criminal activity.
You mentioned several co-conspirators in the indictment. Who are they, and why should we be concerned about their inclusion here?
Yeah, so anyone who looks at this indictment, there are individuals that are mentioned as WLA dash, and then they have numbers. And WLA2 is Daniel Domscheit-Berg, who was someone who was a spokesperson with WikiLeaks early on, mainly around the disclosures that Chelsea Manning provided to WikiLeaks. And then we all know there was a falling out between Daniel and Julian Assange. And he now is in Germany. And the other person who is in the indictment as WLA3 is Jacob Appelbaum. And Jacob Appelbaum was someone who worked for the Tor Project. He also represented WikiLeaks at the Hope Conference. He had spoken on WikiLeaks' behalf as well, represented the organization. He worked on the Snowden documents, and he also was one of the individuals who gained notoriety in 2010 when the U.S. Justice Department targeted his Twitter account and tried to obtain the data, and they were successful in obtaining this data for the grand jury investigation that they opened up into WikiLeaks, which of course produced the indictment against Julian Assange that we're discussing right now. And then I mentioned Sarah Harrison, and she's WLA4. And Sarah and Jacob are both, and then along with Daniel, but both Sarah and Jacob basically fled their home countries and are living in Berlin, in Germany, and they've been fearful that they are going to be prosecuted and or indicted by the United States government. And so it certainly seems with this indictment, we now have some of the first evidence that the government really does view them as unindicted co-conspirators. And that changes the terrain significantly because they now definitely must worry about their futures.
What is the alleged crime Assange himself is accused of in this indictment?
So this indictment is the same as the superseding indictment that existed last year in 2019 in May. And it is 18 charges. There are 17 that are violations of the Espionage Act. Primarily, it is dealing with the disclosures that WikiLeaks published from Chelsea Manning. They want to say that the publication of military documents about Afghanistan, I mean, it's remarkable that we're talking about this at a time when we see renewed efforts to scuttle a withdrawal of U.S. forces and end to the Afghanistan war. So they're coming after Julian Assange for the role that he played in publishing these Afghanistan war logs that came from Chelsea Manning. And then there's one charge that's a conspiracy to commit a computer crime charge. And that one is something that seems like it's not targeting journalism, but when you look at it closely, it's really there to make it easier for the Justice Department to sell targeting a journalist who is involved in the publication of information. It's really there so that they can maintain that they're going after somebody who is more of a hacker or a hacktivist and not somebody engaged in typical journalism.
And that brings us to the question, why is the timing of this news significant, and what do you believe the purpose of this indictment is, considering it doesn't add any new charges?
I think the timing is because they may feel that they have a weaker case than they believed. I was present for the 1-week extradition hearing that took place back in February. We saw the information that they put on, or the evidence that they tried to put on the record, the so-called evidence. And they may feel that it's weaker because the defense was able to pick it apart, particularly the claim about trying to help Chelsea Manning crack a password in order to get into a military computer. That is one of the focal points of the conspiracy to commit a computer crime charge. And so they figure that they can cram all this additional supporting information into that charge about recruiting hackers or recruiting systems administrators, and it might be helpful in selling that Julian Assange should be extradited to the judge. And of course, and her name is Vanessa Baretzer. She is the judge that has been overseeing the extradition process in the United Kingdom. I also want to mention that the timing perhaps suggests what the Justice Department decided to do, having failed to coerce and punish and force Chelsea Manning and Jeremy Hammond to testify before the grand jury. And so back in March, on March 12th, this was right when we were seeing the country shut down to respond to the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic, we had Judge Anthony Trenga in the Eastern District of Virginia shut down and dismiss the grand jury. And then Chelsea Manning, who had just attempted suicide the day before, was released from jail. She was in jail for about a year, resisting, maintaining that she was not going to give any information whatsoever to this grand jury, not going to testify and answer their questions, believing that they were illegitimate. Same with Jeremy Hammond. Jeremy Hammond is a lesser-known figure, but Jeremy was involved in the hack against Stratfor, this private intelligence consulting company, and he was serving his 10-year sentence. He was sentenced to prison, was just at the tail end of his 10-year sentence, and was brought to Alexandria and jailed after he refused to testify, just like Chelsea Manning had refused to testify. And so then both of these people were released, and it was apparently determined by the Justice Department that it was no longer worth it to try to get information from them. And then they turned to relying on information from paid informants of the FBI who had been involved in the WikiLeaks organization to some respect, or had been involved in hacking the Stratfor, and those are the individuals now that they're turning to in order to bolster some of their claims they're making about what WikiLeaks staff were doing against the United States.
Let's get into that a little bit deeper. Explain the role actual FBI informants played in building this case, not only against Assange, but you brought up Jeremy Hammond as well. Yeah,
so there are two paid FBI informants that are central to this expanded indictment. First, you have an individual who is mostly, I think, unknown to Americans. His name is Ziggy. He is someone who was a teenager. If you look at the indictment, they name a teenager. They don't name him, but they actually could now because he's no longer 17. But Ziggy Thordarson was a figure who was involved in overseeing a chat room that WikiLeaks had. It was the first point of contact for connecting with volunteers, connecting with journalists, outside groups. And he actually was accused of embezzling $50,000 in funds from the merchandise store that WikiLeaks had set up. He was somebody who was accused of being a routine fabricator. In fact, a story that was written about him in Wired that I relied on for my coverage of the indictment, it's called The WikiLeaks Mole. In order for that story to be put together, the journalists working on it forced him to provide primary source documents so that they could prove that he wasn't lying to them about the things he was saying, because he had such a reputation of being a fabricator. And so he was investigated by the Icelandic police. They investigated him for financial and tax crimes in addition to this embezzlement charge that WikiLeaks made against him. And he was paid by the FBI. He was paid $5,000. He made trips to Alexandria. We know he gave testimony that is part of this grand jury investigation intended to destroy WikiLeaks. And so that's him. That's Ziggy. And Ziggy was also someone who was around when the hacking was going on against the Stratfor intelligence consulting firm. And he was someone who was even, you could connect to the second figure who I'm going to name, which is Hector Xavier Monsegur, or Sabu. And Sabu is someone who, according to Del Cameron, who has done some reporting from New York for the Daily Dot, was someone who introduced Hammond to a hacker named Hiria, who supplied download leaks to the full credit card database, as well as the initial vulnerability access point to Stratfor's system. He's someone who introduced Jeremy Hammond to Stratfor. That target had not necessarily been selected yet. And then Hector came along and provided that target information. He gave this group Antisec, which is basically kind of LulzSec, this group of hackers, he gave them information to help them target Stratfor's, go after their private intelligence systems. He pushed Hammond and others, according to Del Cameron, to unknowingly transfer multiple gigabytes of confidential data to one of the FBI's servers, and that included roughly 60,000 credit card number and records for Stratfor customers that Hammond was ultimately charged with stealing. Now, we also know from someone who has done a lot of documenting of Anonymous and this universe of hackers that became sources for information for WikiLeaks. Gabrielle Coleman, she wrote this book called Hacker, Hoaxer, Whistleblower, Spy, The Many Faces of Anonymous. We know in that book that Hammond told her that when he was communicating with, that when Sabu was communicating with WikiLeaks, they first asked to authenticate the leak by pasting them some samples, which I did. So Hammond's saying he pasted samples of the leaks to WikiLeaks, and they didn't ask who I was or even really how I got access to it. But I told them voluntarily that I was working with Antisec and had hacked Stratfor. But then soon after the handoff of information, soon after he does that, he does what a source does with a journalist organization. Sabu came in and found out, and he told Hammond basically that sorry, I'm kind of stumbling here, but later on in the thing, he is someone who is asking WikiLeaks for cash in return for the documents. And essentially, if any source ever asks for cash, you should know that you're being set up in a sting operation by the Justice Department.
Yeah, the point here, and you did a great job breaking down these very complicated elements, is that the involvement of Sabu and Siggy raised serious questions about FBI entrapment in this case. I want to move on to something else, though, which is why exactly did the Obama administration opt to not make this case against Assange, and why do you believe the Trump administration has moved ahead with it?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with the figure who occupied the Attorney General position when Trump assumed office, and that is Jeffrey Beauregard Sessions was the Attorney General, and he has quite a history and loathing of leaks. You could go back to his time in the Senate. He was one of the few senators who would back legislation in order to criminalize the publication of classified information. He backed official secrets law, much like the kind of law that exists in the United Kingdom. He was for legislation that would completely undermine the First Amendment and freedom of the press in this country. And so, given the opportunity to restart this grand jury investigation, which, by the way, I'll just go off on a bit of a tangent here and say that I think there aren't enough people who make the connection, because this grand jury could have been completely and totally dissolved. It could have been ended under Attorney General Eric Holder. And Eric Holder never held a press conference, or no U.S. attorney with the Justice Department that I know of ever held a press conference and announced that the investigation into WikiLeaks was over. They never held any kind of a press conference and said that they were ending this investigation, let alone admitted that it was a poor choice to go after this organization because it would jeopardize all media organizations. We know that there was a report that's received a lot of citation from media because it mentioned something called the New York Times problem that was allegedly acknowledged by Obama Justice Department officials, saying that if they went after Julian Assange and Wikileaks, then it would leave New York Times editors and others who were working on classified information that they obtained from sources, it would leave them vulnerable. But what we never had was any kind of a press conference that announced that this was all done. So it basically laid in dormant for Donald Trump to enter, and then for anybody he appointed, and that person was Jeff Sessions. And so Jeff Sessions came in, started this grand jury investigation back up, and they've now been able to piece it together as it becomes politically useful for them to go after and target WikiLeaks. And I think that one of the things that's going to come out as this extradition process continues, as these hearings are held, and as he may or may not be ultimately brought to the United States, you're going to see the way in which this is entirely politicized by Donald Trump's administration. It has nothing to do with any criminal activity, and has everything to do with people within the Justice Department believing that this case is something that could benefit them politically.
Kevin, I remember a time when Assange was considered a major ally to even mainstream media. But today, unfortunately, even progressive alternative media outlets don't give his case the coverage it deserves. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I would agree with you that largely people have tuned out and they've allowed the character assassination and public mobbing of Julian Assange that has taken place in a very sustained way for the last 10 years to influence their views of him as well as the entire organization, even though there are other people outside of Julian Assange who have worked for and with WikiLeaks. And the immediate reaction to this expansion of an indictment was to essentially regurgitate what the Justice Department was putting out in their press release, and to go around and say that the indictment has evidence that Julian Assange was trying to recruit hackers, and it largely ignored everything we talked about at the beginning of this interview related to Snowden and the dangerous future that may lie ahead if you can go after organizations for engaging in this kind of source protection and helping them seek political asylum. And it's true that something very dramatic has happened in our country, in the United States, in the last, say, 4 to 5 years, where you've seen both political factions, whether you're conservative or liberal, basically turn against a organization that has dedicated itself to radical transparency and seeking to expose information. I think that, like, when you get down to it, they truly are holding up the highest principles of journalism, believing that there's information that the U.S. government is hiding, and there are abusive purposes involved, and they're hiding that information because there's corruption that they want to conceal. And we are a site that employees of the government can turn to in order to expose that corruption. They hold themselves out as that kind of an organization, and people have resented them because they publish information that does not suit their own politics. So whether that be exposing the U.S. military, exposing war crimes, exposing what State Department diplomats were up to in the Middle East and other parts of the world, that had turned off conservatives. What turned off liberals was the publication of the emails from Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman, John Podesta. And even though that has nothing to do with this indictment, and none of the timeline has expanded to cover that publication, they still are upset, and they believe that Julian Assange was responsible for Donald Trump's election. And so believing that, they have completely turned off any interest in showing solidarity with Julian Assange. And I think whether you're a journalist or simply a citizen, your ignorance of this case is done at your own risk, because what is happening is going to be a setback for the First Amendment if Julian Assange is successfully brought to the United States and put on trial. Simply put, what we are seeing criminalized it's very clear when you look at this indictment, what they want to go after is your right to publish stolen or hacked information. And be that as it may, you might be surprised to learn that in the US, all journalists have a right to publish stolen and hacked information. In fact, it was actually defended by a federal judge last year in August. His name is Judge John Kodal. He's in the Southern District of New York. And there, the Democratic National Committee tried to bring a lawsuit against freedom of the press by targeting Wikileaks for publishing the Clinton campaign emails and the DNC emails, arguing that there was some kind of conspiracy between WikiLeaks, Trump, and the Russian government. And essentially, what we got because of the DNC's hubris and their obnoxiousness, we got a clear ruling from a judge that highlighted the Pentagon Papers, that said he was against prior restraints, which is suppressing the publication of information. And he said very clearly, whether or not WikiLeaks knew the materials were obtained illegally, they are protected by the First Amendment. I'll just read you this quote as I wrap up this response here. The First Amendment prevents such liability in the same way it would preclude liability for press outlets that publish materials of public interest despite defects in the way the materials were obtained, so long as the disseminator did not participate in any wrongdoing in obtaining the materials in the first place. And what you can't find very clearly in this indictment is evidence that Julian Assange was orchestrating the hacking. And, despite what they want to claim through chat logs, something that has been omitted from the indictment is that the hacking of Stratfor actually occurred, according to Del Cameron at Daily Dot, it occurred 83 days before Julian Assange was ever aware that Stratfor was being targeted. And so there's a lot here that has to be brought out. There's a lot of work that his defense attorneys are going to need to do. But I think, as has been true all along, that there are many factual deficiencies in the way that the prosecution or the Justice Department is approaching this case that will show that it's simply not based in reality. We've seen a concocting of conspiracy theories around Julian Assange by the Justice Department for the last year, and it just keeps escalating and escalating because they'll stop at nothing to bring Julian Assange to the U.S. and make an example out of him.
And finally, Kevin, what is the latest you have heard regarding Assange's condition as he is in Belmarsh prison in the UK? And what is the current status of his case, which I know you've done a great job monitoring?
Yeah, so the latest status for Julian Assange is that he is saying that he is too ill to participate in just a standard case management hearing that is taking place every month between attorneys. And those attorneys are basically checking in virtually because of the COVID-19 pandemic that remains a threat. And he has not been able to join via video because moving to the location in the Belmarsh prison where he has to go, he's afraid he might come into contact with someone who could be infected and then contract the virus. He's one of those prisoners who is highly vulnerable to picking up the virus, and then he would become extremely ill, he believes. And so they've exercised a lot of precautions, but exercising those precautions has meant that he's not been able to have a lot of phone calls with his attorneys. He's not been able to work on his case. And in the meantime, we've seen that there are lawyers groups in the UK. There are doctors, coalitions of doctors that have formed to lobby and demand that he is allowed out on bail earlier on in this year, right when the COVID-19 pandemic was intensifying. There was an effort to obtain bail. The judge denied it. They will not allow him to go into home confinement, which is really what should happen, because when you think about it, there is a lot of unpredictable things going on in this world right now, especially around this virus and whether governments are responding to it appropriately in order to protect their populations. There's a limit to travel. It's unclear how this hearing is going to be held with all the witnesses that need to be able to participate in order for the defense to put on evidence and try to rebut claims that Julian Assange should be extradited to the United States. And so that being said, you have due process rights issues that come up. And on one hand, you understand why the defense wants to push on and just allow the hearing to happen in September. But on the other hand, you may not be able to have access and transparency to the proceeding. There may be a limit to journalists who can access. The public will be limited in their ability to access. The best thing for Julian Assange may be to allow him back into a home under confinement and push this into next year. We already were expecting a 4 to 5 year process that would unfold with this extradition anyways, because it's going to go to appeal courts in the UK before an ultimate decision is made. We know that on July 10th, there's a deadline for the defense to put all of its evidence into a record for these upcoming hearings. And so it's another thing I left out is that they feel like the Justice Department was kind of jamming them by adding these additional details into this indictment at the last minute. And now they already have difficulty talking to Assange, and they have to be able to skirt that. And so, essentially what I'd say is we don't really know what's going to happen next with Julian Assange, but people should be constantly demanding that he is released from jail, because he's only there because he claimed asylum. He's only there because he sought some kind of safety from U.S. prosecution in an Ecuador embassy. He was hounded and he was harassed by the Ecuador government, and they made him essentially feel like he was stir crazy, and they induced paranoia. They engaged in psychological torture. Eventually, he was forced out of the embassy last year in April. He served almost the maximum for jumping bail because the UK and the United States, along with Sweden and Ecuador, have total contempt for the institution of political asylum. And then now, rather than let him out into home confinement, they maintain this belief that he's somehow going to escape and flee the country in the middle of a global pandemic. And for that, he is suffering in a prison that is largely for counterterrorism suspects. And he is ailing there as the UK, like other prisons around the world, deny the threat of the COVID-19 virus within the walls of that facility.
Kevin Gosztola, I'm really grateful that you've stayed on top of this case to make sure Julian Assange is not forgotten, and also that you made time to speak with me today. Again, really appreciate you and your work.
Yeah, thank you.